Whispers of the Pacific, an introduction to the Coast Watchers. Picture, if you will, a lone figure silhouetted against the crimson dawn of a Pacific morning in 1942. He stands on a coral ridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon where sea meets sky in an endless blue embrace. Below him, coconut palms sway in the trade winds, their fronds whispering secrets that only he seems to understand. This man wears no uniform, carries no rifle, yet his observations will soon determine the fate of thousands of Allied servicemen scattered across the vast theater of the Pacific War. His name might be Jack Reed, or Paul Mason, or Donald Kennedy. But tonight, he represents something far greater than any single individual. He is one of the Coast Watchers, perhaps the most ingenious intelligence network ever conceived in the crucible of modern warfare. And his story begins not with the thunder of naval guns or the roar of aircraft engines, but with the quiet genius of strategic foresight and the desperate improvisation born of impending catastrophe. To understand the Coast Watchers, we must first understand their world. The Solomon Islands, the Bismarck Archipelago, New Guinea's countless inlets and hidden bays, these were not merely dots on a military planner's map. They were living, breathing ecosystems where every reef, every lagoon, every mountain peak held tactical significance that would only become apparent when the storm of war finally broke across the Pacific. In 1939, as Europe descended into darkness, the Pacific remained deceptively tranquil. British and Australian colonial administrators went about their quiet business of governing scattered island territories. Plantation managers supervised copra harvests. Missionaries tended to their flocks in villages accessible only by native canoe or seaplane. Radio operators maintained tenuous links between isolated outposts and the wider world. Life moved at the gentle pace of the tropics, measured not in hours but in seasons, not in urgent dispatches but in the patient rhythms of island existence. Yet even then, perceptive minds were beginning to grasp the strategic implications of Japan's expanding ambitions. The Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937 had already demonstrated Japanese willingness to pursue military solutions to political problems. Intelligence reports, filtering through diplomatic channels, painted an increasingly troubling picture of Japanese naval construction, airfield development, and territorial consolidation throughout the mandated islands of the Central Pacific. Enter Commander Eric Felt of the Royal Australian Navy, a man whose background perfectly suited him for the extraordinary challenge he was about to undertake. Felt had spent years in Pacific waters, first as a young midshipman, later as a communications specialist who understood both the technical possibilities and practical limitations of radio equipment in tropical conditions. More importantly, he possessed that rare combination of tactical imagination and administrative competence that would prove essential for managing a network of independent operators scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. In late 1939, Felt received what appeared to be a routine assignment: develop contingency plans for intelligence gathering in the event that Japanese forces moved south toward Australian territorial waters. What seemed like a theoretical exercise would soon become one of the war's most crucial operational requirements. Felt's genius lay not in revolutionary technology or massive resource allocation, but in his recognition of assets already in place. Throughout the island chains that formed natural stepping stones between Japan and Australia, there existed a thin but resilient network of Europeans who knew the terrain intimately, spoke local languages, commanded native loyalty, and possessed the technical skills necessary for radio communication. Plantation managers who had spent decades learning to navigate between coral heads in darkness. District officers who could disappear into jungle terrain that would swallow entire battalions. Radio technicians who understood how atmospheric conditions affected signal propagation across vast distances. These men, and they were almost exclusively men in that era, represented something unprecedented in military intelligence. They were not professional spies trained in clandestine techniques. They were not military personnel operating under clear command structures. They were civilians who would voluntarily remain behind enemy lines, accepting isolation, constant danger, and the very real possibility of capture and execution, armed with little more than radio equipment, local knowledge, and an unshakable commitment to the Allied cause. Felt's initial planning sessions, conducted in the comfortable surroundings of naval headquarters in Sydney, must have seemed almost surreal in their implications. Here were staff officers, maps spread across polished tables, calmly discussing scenarios that would place individual volunteers hundreds of miles behind enemy lines with no possibility of immediate rescue or reinforcement. The logistics alone presented extraordinary challenges. How do you maintain radio contact across such distances? How do you supply isolated operators with spare parts, medical supplies, and the basic necessities of survival? How do you coordinate intelligence gathering with tactical requirements that might change hourly as military situations developed? The answers felt developed were elegant in their simplicity and terrifying in their human cost. Each coast watcher would operate independently, reporting directly to headquarters through scheduled radio contacts. They would rely primarily on local support networks, both for physical survival and for the intelligence gathering that justified their presence. They would be given broad operational guidelines but expected to use their own judgment in determining what information was worth the risk of transmission. Most crucially, they would be expendable. This was never stated explicitly in official documents, but everyone involved understood the mathematics of the situation. If Japanese forces overran a coast watcher's position, there would be no rescue mission, no evacuation plan, no negotiated prisoner exchange. The man would simply disappear into the vast anonymity of war, his fate unknown until Japanese records were examined years later, if they survived at all. By early 1941, Felt's network was beginning to take shape. Recruitment proceeded through informal channels, relying heavily on personal recommendations and prior service records. The ideal candidate possessed technical competence with radio equipment, extensive local knowledge, established relationships with native populations, and the psychological resilience necessary for prolonged isolation under extreme stress. Such men were not easily found, and Felt's selection process necessarily emphasized quality over quantity. Training presented its own unique challenges. How do you prepare someone for an assignment that has no precedent in military history? Felt's solution was characteristically practical. Potential coast watchers received intensive instruction in radio procedures, basic intelligence analysis, and emergency medical treatment. They learned to recognize different types of aircraft and naval vessels, to estimate troop strengths and equipment capabilities, and to encode observations in formats that could be transmitted quickly and securely. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to think like intelligence analysts rather than casual observers. The difference between reporting many Japanese planes flew overhead and approximately 40 twin-engine bombers, probably Mitsubishi G4M type, heading southeast at 0800 hours, altitude estimated 8,000 feet, could mean the difference between a successful interception and a devastating surprise attack on Allied positions. The equipment they would carry reflected both the possibilities and limitations of 1940s technology. The standard Coastwatcher radio was a marvel of miniaturization for its era. A 30-pound transceiver capable of reliable communication over distances of several hundred miles under favorable atmospheric conditions. Battery life was measured in hours of actual transmission time, making every radio contact a carefully calculated decision. Spare parts were virtually irreplaceable once supply lines were cut, meaning that equipment maintenance required both technical skill and creative improvisation. As 1941 progressed and Japanese intentions became increasingly clear, Felt's preparations took on new urgency. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December transformed theoretical contingency planning into immediate operational necessity. Within weeks, Japanese forces were advancing through the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the scattered island chains that formed the outer perimeter of Australia's defensive zone. The Coast Watchers were about to face their ultimate test. Men who had volunteered for what seemed like an interesting auxiliary assignment now found themselves on the front lines of a war that would determine the fate of the Pacific. They would witness the collapse of colonial authority, the evacuation of European civilians, and the arrival of Japanese occupation forces. They would see their familiar world transformed into an armed camp, where their very presence meant death if discovered. Yet they would remain at their posts, hidden in jungle observation points and concealed radio shacks, maintaining the thin thread of communication that connected Allied intelligence with the reality of Japanese military movements. Their reports would guide fighter interceptions, naval engagements, and amphibious operations. Their warnings would save countless lives and prevent strategic disasters that could have altered the entire course of the Pacific War. In the months ahead, we will follow these remarkable men through their greatest challenges and most significant contributions. We will witness acts of courage that defy easy categorization, moments of tactical brilliance born from desperate improvisation, and the gradual development of intelligence techniques that would influence military operations for generations to come. But tonight, as we begin this journey into the hidden history of the Pacific War, it is enough to understand that somewhere in the darkness of a tropical night, a lone figure adjusts his radio frequency and begins to transmit the observations that will help determine tomorrow's battles. His voice, barely a whisper in the electronic spectrum, carries the weight of nations and the hopes of free peoples everywhere. The story of the Coast Watchers is about to unfold. Eyes in the jungle, setting up the network. The reality of becoming a Coast Watcher meant accepting isolation that few could truly comprehend. Picture Martin Clemens, a young British colonial administrator who had volunteered for this duty, standing in the pre-dawn darkness on Guadalcanal in early 1941. The jungle pressed against him from all sides, a living wall of green that would become both his protection and his prison. Clemens carried with him the tools of his new trade. A Teleradio 3B wireless set, weighing nearly 40 pounds, its vacuum tubes fragile as eggshells. Spare batteries that would need careful rationing. A .303 rifle with limited ammunition. Maps that showed the coastline but revealed little about the interior where he would soon disappear. Most importantly, he carried a small notebook containing the radio frequencies and call signs that would connect him to a network spanning thousands of miles of ocean. The establishment of each Coast Watcher post followed a careful choreography of concealment. The radio antenna could not be too obvious, yet it needed clear line of sight for transmission across the vast Pacific distances. Clemens chose a ridge overlooking the northern approaches to Guadalcanal, where Japanese ships would most likely appear. Here, 300 feet above sea level, he began constructing what intelligence officers euphemistically called a hide. The work proceeded in stages. First, the careful clearing of just enough vegetation to create a small shelter, using machetes to cut branches that were then woven into camouflaged walls. The radio equipment required protection from the constant humidity that could destroy circuits in a matter of days. Everything had to appear natural from above. Japanese reconnaissance flights were already probing these waters, and a suspicious clearing could mean death. Local assistance proved absolutely critical. The Solomon Islanders understood better than any European the rhythms of their jungle home. They knew which paths avoided Japanese patrols, which plants provided food, and most crucially, they could move through their island networks with an invisibility that no white man could achieve. Many would pay dearly for this loyalty in the months ahead. Communication schedules became the heartbeat of the Coast Watcher network. Each station was assigned specific transmission windows, brief moments when they could break radio silence to report observations or receive instructions. The timing had to account for atmospheric conditions that affected radio propagation across such enormous distances. A message from Guadalcanal to Australia might bounce off the ionosphere multiple times before reaching its destination. The radio procedure itself demanded precision, born of necessity. Every transmission risked detection by Japanese direction-finding equipment. Messages were coded, compressed into the shortest possible bursts. 20 bombers heading southeast, Angels 15, might become a handful of letters and numbers that took only seconds to transmit. But those seconds felt like hours when you knew enemy operators might be triangulating your position. Supply presented another layer of complexity that tested the network's sustainability. Coast Watchers could not simply appear at colonial supply depots to request provisions. Everything had to reach them through clandestine means. Native canoes moving under cover of darkness, or the occasional submarine surfacing briefly offshore to deliver batteries, medical supplies, and news from the outside world. Food became a constant preoccupation. The tropical environment offered some sustenance to those who knew how to find it, but maintaining the energy needed for constant vigilance required more than jungle foraging could provide. Canned goods dropped by aircraft or delivered by native allies became precious commodities, rationed carefully to last between supply runs that might be weeks or months apart. The isolation wore on men, in ways that headquarters could barely comprehend. Imagine spending weeks alone, except for occasional contact with local allies who might speak only pidgin English. The weight of responsibility, knowing that a single missed observation could cost hundreds of Allied lives, combined with the constant threat of discovery, created psychological pressures that no training could fully prepare them for. Medical emergencies presented particular nightmares. A broken bone, infected wound, or tropical disease could not be treated at the nearest hospital. Coast watchers carried basic medical supplies and relied on their own knowledge of first aid, supplemented by whatever traditional remedies their local allies could provide. More than one man would spend weeks fighting malaria alone in his jungle hide, maintaining his watch despite fever that made coherent thought nearly impossible. Then came December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the Coastwatcher network from a precautionary intelligence-gathering operation into a frontline defense system virtually overnight. Radio messages crackling through the Pacific night brought news that changed everything. The war was no longer a distant possibility. It was racing toward them across the ocean at the speed of Japanese task forces. For men like Clemens, already isolated in their jungle posts, Pearl Harbor meant the last tenuous connections to normal life had been severed. No more routine supply runs from colonial headquarters. No more possibility of rotation back to administrative duties. They were now truly on their own, with Japanese forces advancing toward them like a tide that would soon engulf their islands. The urgency of their mission intensified dramatically. Every ship movement, every aircraft sighting, every indication of Japanese intentions now carried immediate tactical significance. The comfortable buffer of peacetime had vanished, replaced by the knowledge that tomorrow might bring enemy soldiers searching the jungle for their radio transmitters. Communication security became even more critical. Japanese intelligence services, now fully committed to Pacific operations, would be dedicating significant resources to locating and eliminating the Coastwatcher network. Direction-finding equipment would be deployed to major Japanese bases, and specialized teams would be trained in radio interception techniques. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor rippled through the network in ways both obvious and subtle. The men knew they were no longer playing a theoretical game of observation and reporting. Real ships were burning, real men were dying, and their intelligence reports would directly influence life and death decisions being made in headquarters thousands of miles away. Yet in their jungle hides, surrounded by the constant symphony of tropical insects and the whisper of trade winds through palm fronds, the Coastwatchers adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience. They adjusted their schedules, refined their procedures, and deepened their relationships with local allies, who would prove indispensable in the dark months ahead. As 1941 drew to a close, the network that Commander Felt had envisioned was becoming operational just as the need for it reached critical urgency. Hidden throughout the Solomon Islands, the Bismarcks, and the scattered atolls of the Pacific, men sat beside their radio sets in the tropical darkness, listening for the distant drone of aircraft engines that would signal the next phase of the war. The infrastructure was in place. The men were at their posts. The frequencies were clear and the codes were ready. Now they would discover whether their careful preparations would prove sufficient for the storm that was about to break over the Pacific. Shadows and signals, the art of observation. The storm arrived with the dawn of February 23, 1942, when Jack Reed crouched in the dense undergrowth above Buka Passage and counted the masts of 18 Japanese warships threading through the coral channels below his hidden position. His hands moved steadily across the radio key, tapping out the coded message that would reach Allied headquarters within the hour, while enemy soldiers established their first outposts less than 3 miles from where he transmitted. This was the reality that Commander Felt's network now faced. The careful preparations, the hidden supply caches, the rehearsed procedures, all of it reduced to a simple equation of survival and intelligence gathering. The Coastwatchers had become ghosts in their own territories, watching the transformation of their peaceful islands into fortified enemy bases. Reed's situation on Bougainville exemplified the delicate balance every Coastwatcher now maintained. By day, he observed Japanese construction activities through field glasses, noting the placement of anti-aircraft guns, counting supply barges, tracking the movement of personnel between installations. His trained eye catalogued details that would prove invaluable to Allied planners: the depth of anchorages, the locations of fuel dumps, the patterns of patrol schedules. But observation required more than technical skill. It demanded an almost supernatural ability to remain invisible while living among people whose loyalties could shift with circumstances. The local populations faced impossible choices. Many had worked alongside these Europeans for years, respected them, even considered them friends. Others saw opportunity in the changing political landscape, or simply sought to protect their families from reprisals. Reed understood these pressures intimately. His survival depended not just on his own caution, but on the discretion of village headmen, the silence of children who might glimpse his radio antenna, the loyalty of guides who knew the location of his camps. He moved constantly, never sleeping in the same shelter twice, communicating through intermediaries whose names he often never learned. The intelligence he gathered followed strict protocols developed through months of refinement. Aircraft sightings included not just numbers and types, but precise headings, altitudes, and formations. Naval movements required detailed descriptions of vessel classes, escort patterns, and anchorage selections. Even seemingly mundane observations, the arrival of construction equipment, changes in radio traffic patterns, the establishment of new supply routes, could provide crucial insights into Japanese strategic intentions. Each message transmitted carried enormous risk. Radio direction finding equipment could triangulate transmission sources within minutes. Japanese intelligence units, well aware of the Coastwatcher network's existence, deployed listening posts and patrol teams specifically tasked with locating hidden operators. Every transmission became a calculated gamble between intelligence value and operational security. The coding systems reflected this reality. Simple substitution ciphers could be memorized completely, eliminating the need for written materials that might compromise the entire network if discovered. Place names became numbers, military units transformed into agricultural references, and ship movements disguised as weather reports. A message describing heavy rain moving southeast with strong winds might actually detail the movement of a Japanese cruiser squadron toward Allied positions. Martin Clemens, now fully established in his Guadalcanal hideout, developed particularly sophisticated observation techniques. His position overlooking what would later become Henderson Field provided unobstructed views of Japanese construction activities. He noted the arrival of engineering units, the stockpiling of aviation fuel, the installation of communications equipment, all clear indicators that the Japanese intended to establish a major airbase. But Clemens also recognized patterns that pure military observation might miss. The arrival of civilian administrators suggested permanent occupation plans. The establishment of medical facilities indicated expectations of prolonged combat operations. The construction of extensive defensive positions revealed Japanese concerns about potential Allied counterattacks. These insights required cultural understanding as much as military knowledge. Clemens had lived on Guadalcanal for years before the war, spoke the local languages, understood tribal relationships and territorial boundaries. This knowledge proved invaluable when selecting observation posts, establishing supply lines, and recruiting local assistance. The relationship between coastwatchers and indigenous populations became one of the war's most remarkable examples of cross-cultural cooperation under extreme pressure. Village leaders risked their community's safety by providing shelter and supplies. Scouts guided operators through terrain they knew intimately, identifying safe passages and warning of Japanese patrol activities. Messengers carried communications across distances that would have taken radio operators days to traverse safely. Yet these relationships remained fraught with complexity and danger. Japanese forces employed increasingly harsh methods to discourage local cooperation with Allied intelligence networks. Villages suspected of harboring coastwatchers faced brutal reprisals. Individuals caught assisting the hidden operators could expect summary execution, often preceded by torture designed to extract information about other network members. Some communities, faced with these impossible pressures, made the pragmatic choice to cooperate with Japanese authorities. Others maintained their loyalty to the Allied cause despite escalating risks. Many found themselves caught between competing demands, trying to protect their people while avoiding accusations of collaboration from either side. The Coast Watchers adapted their operations to these shifting dynamics. They developed protocols for rapid evacuation when local support became unreliable. They established multiple communication routes to prevent the compromise of single informants from destroying entire intelligence chains. They learned to read the subtle signs, changes in village atmospheres, alterations in traditional meeting patterns. The absence of usually reliable contacts that might indicate growing danger. Paul Mason, operating from his position on Bougainville's western coast, exemplified this adaptive approach. His network included not just immediate observers, but secondary contacts who could verify information, alternative messengers who could maintain communications if primary routes were compromised, and early warning systems that could alert him to approaching Japanese search parties. Mason's intelligence proved particularly valuable because of its consistency and accuracy. Allied commanders learned to trust his assessments, using his reports to plan major operations and allocate scarce resources. His observations of Japanese air operations, the timing of patrol flights, the composition of bomber formations, the patterns of fighter escort deployments, enabled Allied forces to anticipate enemy actions and position their own assets accordingly. The psychological pressure on these isolated operators grew steadily as Japanese counterintelligence efforts intensified. Months of constant vigilance, irregular sleep, and persistent danger took their toll. The knowledge that capture meant not just personal death, but the potential compromise of the entire network added layers of stress that few military personnel ever experienced. Yet they continued their patient work day after day, transmission after transmission. Their reports flowed steadily southward to Allied headquarters, where intelligence officers compiled the scattered observations into comprehensive assessments of Japanese capabilities and intentions. Each coded message represented not just tactical information, but proof that the network remained operational, that the hidden watchers continued their vital mission despite escalating dangers. By mid-1942, as Japanese expansion reached its maximum extent and Allied forces began planning their first major counteroffensives, the Coast Watcher network had evolved into something unprecedented in military history. A real-time intelligence system operating behind enemy lines, sustained entirely by the courage of isolated individuals and the loyalty of indigenous communities willing to risk everything for the promise of eventual liberation. The Coral Sea and beyond, impact and consequences. The intelligence flowing from these scattered outposts would soon prove its strategic value in ways that even Commander Felt had not fully anticipated. In early May 1942, as Japanese naval forces moved through the Solomon Islands toward the Coral Sea, Coast Watcher reports began painting a picture that would fundamentally alter the course of the Pacific War. From his concealed position on Bougainville, Paul Mason watched through his binoculars as formation after formation of Japanese aircraft passed overhead, their engines creating a steady drone that seemed to vibrate through the jungle canopy. Each sighting went immediately into his radio reports. Aircraft types, numbers, headings, timestamps. The information seemed routine, part of the daily intelligence harvest that had become second nature to the Coast Watchers. But in the operations rooms of Brisbane and Pearl Harbor, these fragments of information were being assembled into something far more significant. The pattern of Japanese air movements, combined with naval intercepts and other intelligence sources, revealed the enemy's intention to establish air bases at Port Moresby and Tulagi, a move that would place Japanese bombers within easy range of Australia's eastern coast. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought between May 4th and 8th, 1942, became the first naval engagement in history where opposing fleets never came within sight of each other. Aircraft carriers launched their strikes across hundreds of miles of open ocean, guided by intelligence that often originated from lone men hiding in jungle observation posts. When Japanese planes approached Allied positions, many had already been tracked and reported by Coast Watchers hours before they reached their targets. The tactical impact was immediate and measurable. Allied fighters, forewarned by Coast Watcher reports, were able to intercept Japanese formations with devastating effect. The strategic impact would prove even more significant. The Japanese advance toward Australia had been checked, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, a major Japanese offensive had been turned back. But success came with a price that the Coast Watchers understood all too well. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing their unexpected losses, began to suspect the existence of an organized observation network operating behind their lines. Radio direction finding equipment arrived at Japanese bases throughout the Solomons. Systematic searches of suspected areas intensified. The hunters were becoming the hunted. On New Georgia, Reginald Evans had established one of the most productive coastwatcher stations in the network. A former plantation manager who knew every ridge and valley of his island, Evans had built a sophisticated operation that included multiple observation posts, cached supplies, and a network of local informants who could track Japanese movements across the entire island group. Evans understood the mathematics of his situation with the clear-eyed pragmatism that characterized the best coastwatchers. Each radio transmission revealed his approximate position to Japanese direction finders. Each successful interception of enemy aircraft, guided by his reports, increased the likelihood that Japanese intelligence would intensify their search efforts. The more effective he became, the greater the danger to himself and to the local people who supported his mission. The psychological pressure was unlike anything experienced by conventional military units. A soldier in a frontline position faced immediate visible threats, but also had the support of his unit, clear command structures, and defined objectives. The coastwatchers operated in a twilight world where success was measured by information transmitted rather than territory held, where their greatest victories were often invisible to them, and where the enemy's response to their effectiveness was an ever-tightening circle of pursuit. The isolation wore on them in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Martin Clemens, still operating from his hideout on Guadalcanal, found himself talking aloud to maintain some connection to human speech during the long hours between radio schedules. The simple act of preparing a meal became a complex calculation of smoke dispersal, cooking odors, and the likelihood of Japanese patrols in the area. Sleep became fragmented, punctuated by the need to listen constantly for aircraft engines, boat motors, or the subtle sounds that might indicate approaching search parties. Dreams, when they came, were often filled with the mechanical rhythms of Morse code or the anxiety of missed radio schedules. The boundary between waking vigilance and sleeping unrest began to blur. Yet the intelligence continued to flow. From Buka, Jack Red reported the movement of Japanese reinforcements toward New Guinea. From Choiseul, coastwatcher Donald Kennedy documented the construction of new airfields and supply dumps. From dozens of other positions throughout the island chains, the network maintained its watch, feeding information into an intelligence system that was becoming increasingly sophisticated in its ability to transform isolated observations into strategic understanding. The Japanese response evolved with methodical efficiency. Counterintelligence units trained specifically in anti-guerrilla operations arrived from Japan. Local populations suspected of supporting Allied intelligence activities faced increasingly harsh interrogation and collective punishment. Reward systems were established, offering substantial payments for information, leading to the capture of Allied operatives. Some coastwatchers were forced to relocate their base camps multiple times as Japanese search patterns grew more systematic. Others found their supply drops compromised, forcing them to rely entirely on what they could obtain locally or cache in advance. The network that had seemed so robust in its early months began to show signs of strain as individual operators faced mounting pressure. The intelligence itself became more precious as it became more difficult to obtain. A single sighting report from a coastwatcher position now represented not just tactical information, but proof that the observer was still operational, still free, still able to contribute to the larger Allied effort. Each successful radio contact carried an emotional weight that transcended its immediate intelligence value. By late 1942, as Allied forces prepared for their first major offensive operations in the Pacific, the Coastwatcher network had proven its strategic worth beyond any doubt. The intelligence flowing from their positions had contributed directly to Allied victories at Coral Sea, and would soon prove equally vital to the upcoming operations against Guadalcanal and other Japanese strongholds. But the human cost of this intelligence success was becoming increasingly apparent. The men who had volunteered for what seemed like an extended camping trip with military purpose now found themselves at the center of a deadly game of hide-and-seek, where the stakes were not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who had chosen to help them. The peaceful Pacific world that had existed before the war seemed like a memory from another lifetime. The plantation managers, colonial administrators, and traders who had become the eyes and ears of Allied intelligence were being transformed by their experience into something entirely different. Veterans of a kind of warfare that had no precedent and no clear rules of engagement. As the Japanese net continued to tighten around their positions, each coast watcher faced a fundamental question that would define not just their own survival, but the future effectiveness of the entire intelligence network. How long could they continue their vital mission before the hunters finally became the hunted? Survival and resilience, tales of endurance. The answer came not through grand strategic planning, but through the quiet innovations born of necessity, and the deep bonds forged between desperate men and the island communities that chose to shelter them. On Bougainville, Paul Mason had learned that survival meant becoming invisible in plain sight. His radio post, once a fixed position overlooking Buin Airfield, now moved every 3 days. Mason and his team of Solomon Islander scouts had developed a system of concealment that would have impressed any intelligence school. Camouflaged shelters that could be dismantled in minutes. Radio equipment that broke down into components small enough to carry through jungle paths. And most critically, a network of safe houses that stretched across the island like an underground railway. The key to Mason's survival lay in understanding something the Japanese intelligence officers never quite grasped: the difference between collaboration and partnership. While Japanese forces relied on intimidation and rewards to gather information, Mason had spent months before the war learning Pidgin, sharing medical supplies from his plantation stores, and most importantly, listening to the concerns of village leaders about their families' safety under occupation. When Japanese patrols swept through villages searching for the mysterious radio operator, they found communities that had collectively decided that this particular white man, this master who had treated fever in their children and helped settle disputes over fishing rights, was worth protecting. Information flowed both ways through this network. Village scouts would appear at Mason's temporary shelters with intelligence about Japanese patrol routes, but also with requests. Could the Australian radio help locate a missing fisherman? Could medicine be requested in the next supply drop for an outbreak of dysentery? This symbiotic relationship created something unprecedented in intelligence operations, a spy network that functioned as a community service. Mason found himself coordinating not just military intelligence, but rescue operations for downed Allied pilots that involved entire village populations. When Lieutenant Robert Scott's P-40 crash-landed in the jungle near Mason's position in June 1942, the rescue operation that followed revealed the true sophistication of the Coast Watcher network. Scott, badly injured and disoriented, was found not by Mason's official scouts, but by a 12-year-old boy gathering fruit who recognized the American pilot's uniform from descriptions passed down through village networks. Within hours, Scott was in a canoe heading toward Mason's current position, while behind him, villagers were already scattering wreckage and covering crash marks with carefully transplanted vegetation. Mason's treatment of Scott illustrated the medical challenges that Coast Watchers faced daily. With limited supplies and no formal medical training, Mason had to perform what amounted to battlefield surgery using improvised instruments. A straight razor sterilized over a kerosene flame, silk parachute cord for sutures, and sulfur powder that had been carefully hoarded from his dwindling medical kit. The operation took place by candlelight in a village hut, with local women assisting as nurses and providing traditional remedies that Mason had learned often worked better than his limited Western medicines. But Scott's rescue presented Mason with a new dilemma that highlighted the psychological complexity of Coast Watcher operations. The pilot's presence endangered not just Mason's position, but every village that helped move him toward eventual evacuation. Yet abandoning Scott would violate both Mason's personal code and his carefully built relationship with local communities who expected him to value Allied lives as highly as he valued their own safety. The solution came through what Mason later called distributed responsibility. Instead of moving Scott through the network as quickly as possible, they established a recovery station where Scott could regain strength while contributing to intelligence operations. The pilot's technical knowledge of aircraft recognition proved invaluable. Scott could identify Japanese aircraft types from engine sounds alone, and his understanding of flight patterns helped Mason provide more precise intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, Martin Clemens was discovering that survival often required abandoning the very equipment that made his mission possible. As Japanese forces landed in increasing numbers throughout mid-1942, Clemens made the difficult decision to cache his primary radio equipment and operate using only emergency backup transmitters with limited range and battery life. This forced innovation in communication techniques that would become standard practice throughout the Coastwatcher network. Messages became compressed into coded numerical sequences that could be transmitted in 30-second bursts. Clemens developed a system of relay stations using local runners who could carry coded messages to higher ground where brief radio contact was possible. Most ingeniously, he established a network of signal fires that could communicate basic information: enemy aircraft approaching, all clear or assistance needed, across distances of 20 miles using prearranged smoke patterns. The psychological toll of this isolation weighed heavily on Clemens. His diary entries from this period, later recovered, reveal a man struggling not just with physical survival, but with the mental challenges of complete uncertainty. "No word from Port Moresby for 6 days," he wrote. "Don't know if my reports are getting through. Don't know if anyone knows we're still alive. Beginning to wonder if the war has moved on without us." Yet Clemens found resilience through routine and purpose. Each morning began with the same careful ritual: checking equipment, reviewing intelligence priorities, and most importantly, maintaining detailed written records of observations. This documentation served both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it ensured that intelligence would survive even if Clemens did not. Psychologically, the act of writing imposed order on chaos and maintained his identity as a professional intelligence officer rather than simply a fugitive. The relationship between coastwatchers and rescued Allied personnel evolved into something resembling a temporary military unit. Downed pilots and sailors brought news from the outside world, technical expertise, and most importantly, confirmation that the intelligence network's reports were reaching Allied commanders and influencing operational decisions. In return, coastwatchers provided not just shelter and medical care, but integration into ongoing intelligence operations. This collaboration produced some of the most detailed tactical intelligence of the Pacific War. Rescued aircrew could confirm the effectiveness of bombing raids that coastwatchers had observed, while coastwatchers could provide the kind of ground truth verification that aerial reconnaissance could never achieve. Together, they developed techniques for damage assessment, target identification, and operational planning that would influence Allied strategy throughout the Solomon Islands campaign. As 1942 progressed into its final months, the Coastwatcher network had evolved from a collection of isolated radio operators into something approaching a covert military organization. They had developed their own supply lines, medical protocols, communication procedures, and most importantly, a shared understanding that their survival depended not on avoiding contact with local populations, but on becoming integral parts of island communities that had chosen to resist Japanese occupation. This transformation would prove crucial as Allied forces prepared for their first major offensive operations in the Pacific. Operations that would depend entirely on the intelligence network that had learned to survive by becoming indispensable to the very people they had originally been sent to observe. Hint: whispers of rescue. By August 1943, the intelligence flowing from these embedded networks had become so vital that Allied command faced a sobering realization. The very success of their Coastwatcher operations had painted targets on the backs of every man still operating behind enemy lines. Jack Reed understood this reality better than most. From his concealed position on Bougainville, he had watched Japanese patrols grow more systematic, more determined. The enemy had learned to read the signs: freshly cut trails that appeared overnight, native carriers moving with unusual purpose, the subtle changes in local behavior that indicated foreign presence. Reed's radio reports had guided countless Allied strikes, but each successful mission brought Japanese investigators closer to his hidden camp. The decision to extract Red came not from his own request, but from intelligence intercepts revealing that Japanese forces had narrowed his location to a 5-mile radius. The submarine rescue operation, designated Moonbeam Charlie, required precision timing that would have impressed even the most experienced naval strategists. On the night of September 15th, USS Gato surfaced 3 miles off Bougainville's western coast, her conning tower barely visible above the gentle Pacific swells. Reed had spent 3 days moving to the extraction point, guided by local allies who knew every reef, every current, every patrol pattern along that treacherous coastline. The extraction window measured exactly 47 minutes, the maximum time Gato could remain surfaced without risking dawn detection. Commander William Post watched through his periscope as a small outrigger canoe emerged from the coastal shadows. The figure paddling toward them moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to read these waters like a familiar book. This wasn't just an intelligence officer being pulled to safety. This was the end of 18 months of solitary operations that had fundamentally altered Allied understanding of Japanese capabilities in the Northern Solomons. As Red climbed through Gato's forward hatch, he carried with him detailed maps marking every Japanese installation, supply depot, and defensive position across 300 square miles of enemy territory. His debriefing would fill 74 pages of classified reports, intelligence that would prove invaluable during the upcoming Bougainville landings. Yet Red's successful extraction represented both triumph and tragedy. For every coastwatcher who made it home, others remained behind, their isolation deepening as Japanese counterintelligence efforts intensified. Reg Evans had always known his assignment carried exceptional risk. Operating from New Georgia's mountainous interior, he maintained one of the network's most strategically important positions, an observation post that covered the approaches to both Munda Airfield and the critical supply routes through Kula Gulf. His intelligence had guided the naval battles that broke Japanese control of the Central Solomons. But by October 1943, Evans faced an impossible choice. Japanese forces had begun systematically relocating native populations, removing the human camouflage that had protected coastwatcher operations. Local communities that had sheltered him now faced collective punishment for any suspected collaboration. Evans could abandon his post, or continue transmitting intelligence while knowing that each radio signal brought danger closer to the people who had become his extended family. He chose to stay. The final intercept from Evans' radio came on November 3rd, a detailed report on Japanese reinforcements moving through Blackett Strait. The transmission ended abruptly mid-sentence, replaced by the empty static that every coastwatcher had learned to fear. Search teams would later piece together the story from surviving witnesses, a dawn raid by Japanese Marines who had finally triangulated his position through weeks of careful signal analysis. Evans had destroyed his radio equipment and codebooks before capture, maintaining operational security even as his own situation became hopeless. Japanese interrogation records, discovered after the war, revealed that he provided no useful intelligence despite weeks of questioning. His execution came on December 7th, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor had transformed him from a colonial administrator into one of the Pacific's most effective intelligence operatives. These losses weighed heavily on Commander Felt as he reviewed casualty reports in his Brisbane headquarters. The network he had envisioned as a temporary intelligence measure had evolved into something far more complex, a web of relationships and obligations that extended far beyond military objectives. Each name on his casualty list represented not just a trained operator, but an entire community of local allies whose courage had made coastwatcher operations possible. The strategic impact remained undeniable. Intelligence from the Coastwatcher network had influenced every major Allied operation in the Solomons campaign. Their reports had saved countless Allied lives, guided successful naval engagements, and provided the detailed knowledge that made island-hopping warfare feasible. Yet this success had been purchased with a currency that traditional military accounting struggled to measure: the quiet heroism of men who had chosen to remain at their posts even when extraction became impossible. As 1943 drew to a close, the surviving coastwatchers continued their vigil from positions that grew more precarious with each passing week. Echoes of valor, a legacy of courage. As 1943 drew to a close, the surviving coastwatchers continued their vigil from positions that grew more precarious with each passing week. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the vast expanse of the Pacific. The intelligence network that Commander Felt had envisioned in those distant pre-war days had evolved into something far greater than its original conception. The reports flowing back to Allied headquarters now carried a different tenor. No longer the urgent warnings of approaching enemy formations, but increasingly detailed assessments of Japanese withdrawal patterns and defensive preparations. Martin Clemens, still operating from his concealed position on Guadalcanal, found himself documenting not enemy advances, but retreats, recording the systematic abandonment of positions that had once seemed impregnable. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Where once the coast watchers had served as the Pacific's early warning system, they now functioned as the eyes and ears of an advancing Allied force. Their radio transmissions, once whispered in desperate urgency, carried the measured confidence of men who understood that the tide of war had fundamentally shifted. Paul Mason, maintaining his watch from Bougainville, observed this change through the lens of his local partnerships. The village networks that had once hidden him from Japanese patrols now served a different purpose, providing intelligence on enemy supply lines and troop movements that revealed the systematic nature of Japanese consolidation. The relationships built through months of shared danger had created something unprecedented, a hybrid intelligence network that combined Western military training with indigenous knowledge systems. The psychological burden these men carried, however, remained unchanged. Each successful mission brought not relief, but the weight of continued responsibility. They had witnessed their comrades' capture and execution, had seen the price of their intelligence work measured in human lives. Yet they persisted, understanding that their unique position between two worlds, between military necessity and civilian survival, made them irreplaceable. As Allied forces began their systematic advance through the Solomon Islands and beyond, the coast watchers found themselves transitioning from hunted observers to advanced scouts for liberation. The same hidden positions that had sheltered them during the darkest months of 1942 now served as coordination points for Allied reconnaissance missions. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain, weather patterns, and population dynamics proved invaluable as military planners prepared for increasingly complex amphibious operations. The irony was not lost on these men, that their greatest success lay in making themselves obsolete. Each Allied advance reduced the need for their clandestine observations. Each liberated island meant one fewer position requiring their dangerous vigil. Yet they continued, driven by a sense of duty that transcended immediate military necessity. Commander Felt, reviewing their reports from his headquarters in Australia, recognized that his coast watchers had achieved something beyond their original mission parameters. They had demonstrated that effective intelligence work required more than technical skill or military training. It demanded cultural sensitivity, personal courage, and the ability to build trust across profound differences in background and experience. The final months of their operations carried a bittersweet quality. As Allied forces established permanent bases throughout the region, the need for isolated observers gradually diminished. One by one, the coast watchers received orders for extraction, or simply found their positions overrun by advancing Allied units. Their return to conventional military life proved challenging in ways that official debriefings could never capture. These men had operated for months in a space between military structure and civilian improvisation, making decisions that affected not only their own survival, but the lives of entire communities. The transition back to formal command hierarchies required psychological adjustments that few outside their ranks could fully understand. Yet their legacy extended far beyond their immediate military contributions. The intelligence techniques they had developed, the community partnerships they had forged, the cultural bridges they had built, all became templates for future operations in similar environments. Their experience demonstrated that effective intelligence work in complex cultural settings required patience, respect, and genuine human connection. As the Pacific War moved toward its conclusion, the surviving coast watchers found themselves scattered across the globe, some returning to their pre-war lives in Australia and New Zealand, others remaining in the Pacific to assist with reconstruction efforts. Their shared experience created bonds that would endure for decades, connections forged in the crucible of isolation and danger. The sunset over the Pacific that evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had witnessed their vigil through the war's darkest hours. The radio frequencies that had once crackled with urgent intelligence reports now carried routine administrative traffic. The hidden observation posts gradually returned to jungle, reclaimed by the vegetation that had provided such crucial concealment. In the gathering twilight, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface reflecting the last light of day with peaceful serenity. The waves that had once carried enemy fleets now lapped gently against shores where children would soon play without fear, a testament to the quiet courage of those who had watched, and waited, and served. More images for the start. The morning sun would rise again over these islands, casting golden light across waters that had witnessed such profound transformation. In the years that followed the war's end, nature began its patient work of reclamation. Vines slowly covering the abandoned radio equipment, coral growing over the wrecks of warships, and the scars of conflict gradually healing beneath the tropical growth. But the legacy of the Coast Watchers lived on in ways both seen and unseen, in the intelligence networks that would evolve from their pioneering methods, in the understanding that local knowledge and cultural sensitivity could be as powerful as any weapon, and in the quiet recognition that ordinary people, when called upon, could accomplish extraordinary things. The radio frequencies that had once crackled with urgent reports of enemy movements now carried different voices. Weather reports for peaceful shipping, communications between trading vessels, and the everyday chatter of a world at peace. Yet sometimes, in the atmospheric conditions of a Pacific evening, old-timers claimed they could still hear echoes, whispers of those desperate transmissions that had once meant the difference between victory and defeat. On Guadalcanal, where Martin Clemens had spent those harrowing months coordinating intelligence and rescue operations, the jungle had reclaimed most traces of the war. The hidden paths he had used to move between observation posts were now overgrown with flowering vines. The clearings where he had met with local allies were filled with new growth, and the ridgelines from which he had watched enemy movements were crowned once again with undisturbed forest canopy. The descendants of his local allies would sometimes point out landmarks to visiting researchers, a particular tree where messages had been cached, a stream crossing used for clandestine meetings, a cave system that had sheltered wounded Allied pilots. These stories, passed down through generations, preserved the memory of cooperation, emotion, and courage that had flourished in the darkest hours. In the Solomon Islands, where Paul Mason had developed his sophisticated network of observers and rescuers, fishing boats now moved peacefully across waters that had once been contested by great naval forces. The islanders who had risked everything to support the Allied cause had returned to their traditional ways of life, but with a deeper understanding of their connection to the wider world and a quiet pride in the role they had played in shaping history. The beaches where desperate pilots had been pulled from crashed aircraft now welcomed peaceful visitors. The hidden camps where wounded airmen had been nursed back to health were marked only by the occasional rusted fragment of equipment, and the signal fires that had once guided rescue submarines were replaced by the gentle glow of village lanterns reflecting on calm waters. Young people growing up in these communities would learn the stories of their elders, tales of courage and sacrifice that had become part of the oral tradition, legends of cooperation between cultures that had found common cause in the face of tyranny. These narratives, told and retold around evening fires, ensured that the spirit of the Coast Watchers would never be entirely forgotten. The strategic lessons learned from the Coast Watcher network would influence intelligence operations for decades to come. The understanding that effective intelligence required not just technological capability, but cultural sensitivity and human relationships. That the most valuable information often came from those who understood local conditions and could move unseen through familiar territory. And that successful covert operations depended on the trust and support of local populations. Military academies would study their methods, intelligence services would adapt their techniques, and historians would recognize their contribution to the evolution of modern warfare. But perhaps more importantly, their example demonstrated that effective resistance to aggression could emerge from the most unlikely sources, that ordinary citizens, when properly supported and motivated, could become extraordinary assets in the defense of freedom. The technological innovations born from their desperate improvisations would find peaceful applications, improved radio communications for remote communities, better medical supplies for isolated regions, and enhanced transportation networks connecting previously isolated populations. The infrastructure of war had been transformed into the foundation for peace and development. In Australia, where the Coast Watcher network had been conceived and coordinated, monuments would eventually be erected to honour their service. But the most fitting memorials were perhaps the continued relationships between Australia and the Pacific Island nations. Partnerships built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice that had been forged in the crucible of war. The families of those who had served as coast watchers would gather occasionally for reunions, aging veterans sharing memories with the children and grandchildren of their former allies, stories of hardship and heroism that bridged cultural and generational divides, and quiet acknowledgements of sacrifices that had shaped the destiny of the Pacific region. These gatherings, held in settings of tropical beauty, would inevitably turn to contemplation of the larger meaning of their shared experience. The recognition that individual acts of courage, when coordinated with others, could influence the course of history. That the willingness to serve something greater than oneself was perhaps the highest expression of human potential, and that the bonds forged in service to a common cause could transcend all other differences. As evening approached during these reunions, the participants would often find themselves drawn to quiet observation of the sunset, watching as the sky transformed through shades of gold and crimson before settling into the deep purple of tropical twilight. And in those moments of peaceful reflection, they would remember not the terror and hardship of war, but the profound sense of purpose that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The Pacific Ocean, vast and eternal, would continue its ancient rhythm. Waves that had carried the ships of war now bearing the vessels of commerce and friendship, currents that had influenced the movements of great fleets now supporting the migration of marine life and the flow of peaceful trade, and winds that had once carried the sounds of battle now bringing only the calls of seabirds and the whisper of palm fronds. And in the gathering darkness, as the first stars appeared in the tropical sky, the descendants of coast watchers and the communities that had supported them would find peace in the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been in vain, that the freedom they had fought to preserve had taken root and flourished, and that the spirit of cooperation and courage they had demonstrated would continue to inspire future generations facing their own challenges and calling upon their own reserves of quiet heroism to build a world worthy of such profound sacrifice and enduring hope.